Hi, my name is Gerald Campano. I am a former school teacher. I was a teacher for about a decade, and now I am a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the Literacy Studies program. And my areas of interest include literacy studies, critical literacy, research that involves working alongside immigrant, migrant, and refugee communities, and also collaborative and participatory methodologies.
Hello, my name is Maria Paula Ghiso, and I'm a professor in the Department of Curriculum and Teaching at Teachers College, Columbia University. And my work focuses on multilingual literacies, young children's literacies, and classroom practices, and thinking about transnational knowledges in the curriculum and how to facilitate that alongside teachers, students, and families, as well as a range of collaborative and participatory methodologies. Community-based research is a methodology that's driven by the priorities and interests of those most directly impacted by educational inequalities and those who work alongside them. It has a family resemblance to other participatory methodologies like youth participatory action research or practitioner research, where the goal is to really democratize inquiry and help everyone and take the lead as everyone participates in the inquiry process and the research process.
I might also add that community-based research often involves long-term participatory ethnographic engagement with and alongside community members. That includes families, youth, leaders, elders in the community, everything from young children to elders in the community. And I think one of the most foundational principles of community-based research is really this idea of democratizing research and knowledge production and expertise. A presumption of community-based research is really one of radical intellectual equality, viewing everyone as an inquirer, as a theorist, as a researcher, everyone really having the agency to reflect on their conditions in their environment and do research, collect evidence, and act towards change.
One of the foundational principles of community-based research is that research really directly benefits the community members with whom we're partnering. Community-based research projects really unfold in community organizations, in faith-based organizations, in out-of-school educational contexts, after-school spaces. Our own work began in a Catholic parish and its community center. And we really believe strongly that educators and schools have an important role in community-based research, but often the research really kind of germinates in these other adjacent spaces, community spaces where families, youth leaders have the autonomy and agency to really determine the course of their inquiries and name the kinds of problems that they would like to investigate.
Community-based research is first and foremost in the service of community members' own interests, questions, and desires. Um, However, I think it's really important to state that we don't want to presume what those interests are. A big part of community-based research really involves bringing people together in communities of inquiry to reflect on their conditions. And I think very much in the spirit of like Freire, really engage in problem posing in order to kind of together forge a vision of what educational flourishing might look, for members of the community and future generations.
Yeah, so really community-based research brings researchers, educators, and youth, community members, leaders together to investigate problems and issues, areas to make education better as identified by community members themselves. And I think one difference in community-based research is that when we think about bringing researchers and others together, it's really that everyone is a researcher, right? And that communities are already doing research and have in their own practices um, in out of school or non-university context already developed these grassroots research practices that we're seeking to learn from and build on.
And just as everyone's a researcher, everyone's a practitioner in a way as well. We as university-based researchers are very much engaged in a practice of partnering, with community members, which involves in and of itself a lot of relational labor. And, university members themselves, they have a practice, but they're also leaders, they're also intellectuals and thinkers. And this is not to homogenize or flatten roles, I think it's really about leveraging a diverse array of ways of knowing and being and a diverse array of forms of expertise and integrating them to see how they complement one another in order to move the research forward.
Community-based research is a good approach when the goal is really to directly address and investigate issues raised by families, youth, and community leaders, and when these constituents will play a primary role in every step of the research process.
Yeah, I might also add to that is often, family members, youth, and community members are often the objects of educational research, but not necessarily the subjects themselves of the research, the agents of the research. And so I think in a lot of traditional research paradigms, those who are most directly impacted by educational policies and practices are often left out of the process of knowledge construction. So I think it's really good for anyone who wants to take seriously the insights and knowledge and what we call the epistemic privilege of community members themselves. We also think it's really good for, I think, anyone who's interested in developing like horizontal research relationships based on an ethics of like care and reciprocity. A big part of community-based research really involves kind of challenging deeply ingrained extractivist, epistemologies that inform a lot of research paradigms, including kind of more positivistic research paradigms. And I think that community-based research really wants to value, you know, and take seriously the experiences and perspectives, of community members, but it also values very much, and this is something we may talk about later, not just like individual academic cleverness or brilliance, but really collective brilliance, and so I think it's really good for um, anyone who's really interested in ethical and more just educational and research relationships.
Community-based research works best when there's already established trust and relationships. And so one of the foundational principles is that you can't conceive of a research project, even if you have some insight that it might be a good one, and come into a context with that predetermined focus, but really that you need to be in a place, spend times, meet people, listen, learn, and from there develop those projects together. And so what's essential is that there be these established relationships and trust as a foundation for the research and also as an ongoing process that needs to be always deepened and strengthened.
Yeah, just to build off what Maria Paula is saying, one way we often think about it is that really it involves like a creative alchemy of everyone involved in the research project, right? So, youth or family members may have their own interests and desires, but those of us who may be located in a university also come in with our own, forms of expertise and the questions that we bring. But often it's like a chemistry that creates through kind of lived and organic relationships that are developed over time where a research project develops.
One of the biggest challenges of community-based research, I think Gerald mentioned this a bit, is how the collective premise of community-based research can sometimes go against the individualistic groundings of academic processes and practices. So this idea of the individual researcher is really codified in many practices of the academy, such as tenure and promotion processes, notions of productivity, what contribution or impact looks like, and whether something is seen as research or it's just seen as service that is not actually research. So often the academy valorizes a more detached viewpoint, and in foregrounding relationality, in foregrounding being in a place and with people over time. That is slow research that often shows up differently in some of these metrics. And one of the really positive things that I think is happening as universities are having conversations about what it means to do community engaged work and improvement work is that these norms are made of community-based research and other types of collective approaches are made more visible in academic processes and practices.
Yeah, I might also add, and I don't think this is exclusive to community-based research, but I feel like community-based research is or strives to be ideally very attentive to issues of power. And of course, there are always multiple axes of power. There's the power dynamics between, let's say, a university context and the community itself. But there are also power dynamics within the community, there are power dynamics within the university. And I think that community-based research really, tries to be self-reflective about those issues of power and tries to mitigate them, you know, so as to honor everyone's equal participation and honestly everyone's dignity in the research process. I think there are other things as well. Community is not a given. Community is a verb. It's something that always needs to be created, sustained, nurtured, recreated. And that's just a lot of difficult and hard work. I also think something that's really fundamental to community-based research is that it often happens under conditions of precarity. You know, um, Working with family members. We work, for example, in a lot of immigrant, migrant, and refugee communities. And there are always issues of, xenophobic and draconian immigration policies that impact the community members. A lot of the families we work with have had to endure, for example, displacement due to gentrification. A lot of family members, struggle with access to healthcare, and of course, what's central to our work, access to a high quality education. But although those are challenges to the work, it's also the raison d'etre of community-based research. That we're not satisfied with the status quo and how things are going, and that we are trying to create, networks of care and reciprocity through the research process that can hopefully, support community members in exercising their own agency and advocating for themselves and um, the educational empowerment of future generations. The advice I would give someone who wants to get started in community-based research is to really take the time to see what's already going on in communities. That was a real revelation for us. Both Maria Paula and myself, a lot of our original research was classroom and school-based. And actually, it wasn't until we moved back to Philadelphia and there was a moratorium on doing research in the district that we actually looked at out of school and community-based spaces. And there's already so much, like, for example, in the city of Philadelphia where we live, there are very profound organizing legacies. They're very profound intellectual and cultural and activist legacies already occurring in the community, you know. And so a very important first step is to just kind of tap into that work and those very rich legacies. So before we even did kind of community-based research around the experiences of immigrant communities, you know, we spent um, time, for example, just being in dialogue with a lot of grassroots immigrant rights organizations throughout the city. And then when we decided to work in St. Thomas Aquinas, we spent at least a year just being in the community and supporting community members in initiatives that they were already doing. For example, like having a health fair or helping to organize a Know Your Rights workshop or having a literacy night for families. And then after we did that for a while, then we started to really create alongside community members a research agenda together.
I think for university researchers, another piece of advice is really to lay the foundation of cultivating these long-term partnerships as a space of mentoring new generations of scholars to do this work, because a lot of graduate students come with certain commitments to working and supporting families and youth and community leaders with their research. But it's very hard to start that on the timeline of a dissertation uh, process. And often younger scholars, I would say, are discouraged from doing that because of the pressures of the tenure timeline as well. So when graduate students can be mentored into community-based research through an established partnership that that draws on those relational bonds and those trusting relationships that have been built over time, they're better positioned to realize the potentials of community-based research, to do a work that is grounded in this larger legacy of collaboration, and then to when they go off and to their own future work, to nurture other kinds of partnerships.
As everyone knows, trust is really hard to build, but it's easy to lose. And so you know, when researchers have really banked, a sense of goodwill and trust over time, then it's much easier for newer generations to become involved in the work.